Hello to everybody. I am delighted to welcome you to this session on innovation in cities around the world with this terrific panel from around the world who will soon be introducing some compelling governance initiatives that relate to municipal governance from different cities and different regions. So with me today are Erika Arban, who is a postdoctoral fellow and laureate program in comparative constitutional law at the University of Melbourne. Annika Kress, a researcher for the Institute of Comparative Federalism at EURAC Research. Gabriella Saputelli, a researcher for the Institute for the Study of Regionalism, Federalism, and Self-Government at the National Research Council in Rome. And Rich Schragger, a professor at the School of Law at the University of Virginia. So each of the panelists is going to take about 10 minutes to describe their view of innovation as it relates to municipal governance. And then we'll get into the heart of the discussion, bringing out themes like how transferable these initiatives are to other municipalities or other regions, as well as top-down and bottom-up governance, and what it means to make changes in governance systems. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erika Arban, who will give the first presentation.
Thank you, Alexandra, and good evening, everyone from Melbourne, Australia. So my presentation engages with Ron Herschel's latest monograph, City-State Constitutionalism and the Megacity, and with one of the claims made in the book, whereby we need to think about how to carve a thicker, a more robust constitutional space for cities, since until now, constitutional theory and practice has largely ignored cities and the urban areas. To this end, I will briefly illustrate the general constitutional and legal framework of metropolitan cities in the Italian legal system, and I will address the following questions. First, how innovative from a perspective of constitutional design is this entrenchment? And second, is this a good model, a good starting point for a more robust constitutional empowerment of cities? I don't have all the answers for these questions, but I will just put them on the table, and hopefully we will have a conversation afterwards. So I will start with the constitutional framework. In 2001, Title V of the Italian Constitution was amended to strengthen the regional form of government. And as part of this reform, Article 114 was changed to include metropolitan cities as one of the layers in which the Italian Republic is composed, along with municipalities, provinces, and regions. All these entities were described in the Constitution as autonomous entities having their own statutes or charters, their own powers and functions. But then metropolitan cities were also entrenched, constitutionally embedded in Article 118 on subsidiarity and in Article 119 on fiscal federalism. This latter provision mandating that metropolitan cities shall have autonomy of revenues and expenditures and independent financial resources. Now, the constitutional entrenchment of metropolitan cities in 2001 and the state legislation that followed and that I will comment on in a moment did not happen in a vacuum, but were the product of several decades of reflections and discussions on the specific nature and the specific features of metropolitan areas as opposed to smaller or medium-sized urban centers and as opposed to rural areas. Although the Constitution, the Italian Constitution mandates that metropolitan cities are autonomous entities with their own statutes, powers, and functions, however, the Constitution does not spell out the details of this autonomy. So in order to better understand how these metropolitan cities function and are structured, we needed to turn to a state law, and specifically law number 56 of 2014, also known as the Del Rio law, which in practice created metropolitan cities. So I'll turn now to the legal framework for metropolitan cities. So I will comment on some provisions contained in this law, not all of them, because the law is quite rich, quite extensive, but I picked some aspects that I thought might be more useful for this conversation. So first of all, this law identifies and creates the first 10 metropolitan cities, basically transforms the 10 largest cities in Italy into metropolitan cities. And then it also defines metropolitan cities as territorial entities for the vast area, specifying that the territory of these metropolitan cities coincides with the territory of the pre-existing province having the same name, province that is thus suppressed. So, for example, the metropolitan city of Milan coincides with the territory of the former province of Milan. The law also identifies the governing bodies for the metropolitan city, which are the Metropolitan Mayor, the Metropolitan Council, and the Metropolitan Conference. Again, I don't go into the details of this, but I will just say that the Metropolitan Mayor is not directly elected. The Metropolitan Mayor is basically the mayor of the core city, of the main city that is directly elected. So again, as an example, the directly elected mayor of Milan becomes automatically the Metropolitan Mayor of Milan. This raises all sorts of questions, particularly when it comes to the democratic legitimacy of such a body. In terms of powers and functions of metropolitan cities, the law identifies different categories of functions and powers. First, the law identifies those that are considered the fundamental functions of metropolitan cities, which include, for example, territorial and strategic planning of the metropolitan area, coordination and organization of public services, economic and social development, and so forth. Then it identifies a second category, which basically consists of the fundamental powers of the pre-existing province, which are then transferred to the metropolitan city. And then there is a third category, some sort of residual powers that the region can assign to the metropolitan city. However, the main task that we can see from this provision is that metropolitan cities are seen as the engines of development for the metropolitan area, but also for the country as a whole. So the main task of this entity is the strategic development of the territory and the integrated management of services. To this end, metropolitan cities are encouraged, are called directly by the law, but also encouraged by the Metropolitan Charters, the Metropolitan Statutes, to work and function within a broader European and international framework of cities. They are invited to be active in attracting foreign investments, participate in the distribution of European funds, promoting innovative projects, and so forth. The law and the Constitution also prescribes some specific provisions in regard to Rome as the capital city of Italy, which I will not detail now, but we can go back to this during the Q&A session. So I will just go back now to my initial questions that I put on the table. Does this Italian model of constitutional entrenchment of metropolitan cities represent a good model of constitutional empowerment of the urban area? So from the perspective of constitutional design, I would say that the entrenchment in the constitution of metropolitan cities as separate entities from municipalities, from provinces, from other local governments could be seen as highly innovative and novel if we consider that a great majority of constitutions around the world are silent when it comes to a constitutional space for cities. And this testifies to a long tradition of discussion on local governance, on cities, on metropolitan areas in Italy, but also at a European level, and the importance in a way that the European context gives to the principle of subsidiarity. However, this model is still incomplete and perhaps far from being perfect for a number of reasons that I will briefly comment on. First of all, the law that I have just mentioned, this Del Rio law, was supposed to have a transitory nature. It was supposed to anticipate another constitutional reform that would have restructured local governance, constitutional reform that never happened because it was rejected by a referendum. So this law happens to keep this transitory nature, and so it's in an awkward position. Second, metropolitan cities are still quite young. They were created only a few years ago, so perhaps it is still too early to understand whether they are meeting the expectations that the law and the constitution have in their regard. Also, in terms of the autonomy of these entities, although the Constitution, as I said, clearly says that these are autonomous entities with their own statutes, powers, and function, in reality, their practical autonomy, their fiscal, financial autonomy remains limited. Metropolitan cities do not have any constitutionally protected sphere or ambit of legislative autonomy, of legislative powers. Their functions are spelled out in a state law. They do not have legislative powers, but only regulatory powers or statutory powers. And in terms of fiscal or financial autonomy, they are still highly dependent from upper tiers of government to get their funding. Also, there is no clear criteria used to identify what qualifies as a metropolitan city. So at the moment, this category features both a very large, highly urbanized areas such as Milan, Rome, or Naples, but also much smaller realities. And this defeats, in a way, the very nature and identity of what a metropolitan city should be. Also, the fact that it coincides with the former province creates some problems, because it has been raised the question whether metropolitan cities are just another way to refer to what is or what was a province. And also, a final point is that metropolitan cities in and of themselves seldom, if rarely, feature in a public discourse. Everybody who follows the news in Italy is familiar with who is the mayor of these big cities, who is the mayor of Milan, the mayor of Rome, the mayor of Turin. But these political figures, when they appear, when they are interviewed, where they present themselves, they usually identify themselves as mayors of the city, the main city, and not as metropolitan mayors. So my sense is that the political identity of these entities is still to be defined. So, to conclude, certainly there are aspects of significant innovation from the standpoint of constitutional design. The entrenchment of metropolitan cities as autonomous and independent from the other local governments is certainly something quite new, quite original, quite innovative. But the entrenchment of these entities, the constitutional entrenchment of these entities is perhaps not sufficient to create a stronger constitutional space for cities. In order to have this strong presence and strong role of metropolitan cities, other elements are needed, and in particular, perhaps a more defined powers or more substantive fiscal autonomy. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this very nice panel. So Erika has already touched upon the constitutional complexities and the constitutional entrenchment of metropolitan cities, and I will look then into one of the aspects of how they were implemented, which is, as Erika mentioned, through the so-called Del Rio law. Now, to briefly go over some of the points that Erika has already mentioned, to reiterate them, the idea behind the metropolitan cities is certainly very, very interesting, as it is, as it concerns the asymmetric governance of rural and urban areas. And this kind of structural differentiation is certainly very innovative as such. Metropolitan cities are a second-tier local government. And as Erika has mentioned, they're made up of a core city and surrounding municipalities, but in effect, they replace the former provinces also in terms of its territory. The metropolitan cities retain the responsibilities of the provinces and obtain additional tasks that are supposed to enable them to better tackle the challenges of increasing urbanization and metropolitan growth, but also to form wider web networks also within a European context, as mentioned. Now, currently there are 14 metropolitan cities in Italy, 10 directly established through the Del Rio law, and then 3 in the autonomous region of Sicily after, and another one in the autonomous region of Sardinia in 2016. Now, in practice, the establishment of the metropolitan cities through the national ordinary Del Rio law was a top-down implementation by the national legislature after years and years of municipal, provincial, and regional vetoes that blocked previous efforts, as they were fearing what these new entities would mean for their own functioning. So in the end, the national legislature decided to simply convert the old provinces into the new metropolitan cities without changing any of the provincial borders or adapting them to the metropolitan context. This made this more structural change constitutional, as the Constitutional Court has ruled. Boundary changes, on the other hand, would have required more of a bottom-up approach that included local participation and regional consultation. Effectively, this has led to, as Erika has mentioned, this has led to metropolitan cities that do not entirely cover the functional urban areas. So, for example, Milan and Rome, as well as Naples, extend far beyond the provincial borders. And in other cases, the functional urban areas cover only a very small fraction of the actual territory of the new metropolitan cities, especially in the south of Italy, but also in the metropolitan city of Turin and the metropolitan city of Venice. Now, this of course has consequences for the actual innovative potential of the structural local government reform. And here, what I've done is to start tracing this impact of metropolitan city boundaries on the strategic planning of metropolitan cities. So as Erika has mentioned, strategic planning is one of the major tasks that metropolitan cities have gotten. The metropolitan cities, according to the Del Rio law, have to pass 3-year strategic plans that they have to annually update. And so far, unfortunately, only 7 of the 11 metropolitan cities that are required to pass such a strategic metropolitan plan, the metropolitan cities in Sicily do not have to do so, actually, have done so. From these strategic plans, a few preliminary observations can be reported. So if we look at the 7 finalized strategic metropolitan plans, they all outline macro areas of intervention of the metropolitan cities. They outline more specific strategies and explicit actions and projects. And interestingly, the most common themes that emerge across the metropolitan strategic plans are social inclusion, agriculture, landscape, research and education, and more central themes such arguably more central metropolitan themes such as mobility and innovation only come after arguably more rural themes such as agriculture and landscape. And then really innovative, or what arguably are very innovative areas such as smart cities and industry 4.0 only take secondary positions in the metropolitan strategic plans. Now, if you look at the more extreme cases in terms of territory, the provincial territory of Milan is, and now the metropolitan city of Milan is much smaller than the actual functional urban area. And in the case of Turin and Venice, it is the opposite, although they also, in some cases, the functional urban area does not cover the territory of the metropolitan city, but also extends beyond the border in some areas. If we look at their metropolitan strategic plan, we can see that they have to take these territorial realities into consideration in their strategic planning, which of course might take away from their purpose of being metropolitan hubs of innovation in a way. So the metropolitan city of Venice actually mentions in its second of 13 trajectories that it needs a flexible approach to metropolitan geometry in order to be able to reach government objectives. And it mentions treaties, contracts, conferences, unions, and partnerships with other government entities as possible instruments to be able to actually address all the metropolitan needs, whether they be at the level of single municipalities or the level of the entire Venetian lagoon. And here it is the case that the Venetian lagoon actually extends beyond the boundaries of the metropolitan city. The metropolitan city of Milan explicitly mentions intergovernmental cooperation mechanisms with surrounding provinces, and these especially concern mobility. And that is interesting as the functional urban area extending beyond the metropolitan city's territory obviously concerns commuting and people going into Milan for work. That has to be then done through intergovernmental cooperation of second-tier local government, since the functional area is not extends beyond the territory of the metropolitan city of Milan. And then in Turin, it actually is one of the most extreme cases where you have over 200 municipalities that make up the metropolitan city, and it is very, very urban. It's a very, very urban area, and one of the industrial centers of Italy in Turin, but then it was also very rural, highly depopulated alpine valleys and municipalities that are included in it. And the strategic plan explicitly recognizes this very heterogeneous geography of the metropolitan city of Turin and holds that it actually requires a polycentric approach to its internal governing, which requires actions that can be adapted to the differential needs of the various municipal realities that are actually present in the metropolitan city. So to tentatively conclude, it seems that the top-down implementation of the metropolitan cities through a national law, as one scholar put it, breaks the Gordian knot of implementing metropolitan cities, but it does certainly not solve the issues that it maybe wants to address. And the creating metropolitan cities that do not necessarily coincide with their functional urban areas might tie up metropolitan city resources in areas where they could otherwise be doing really nice innovative things and live up to the innovative potential that this asymmetric governance of urban and rural areas offers. So thank you, and I looking forward to the next contributions.
And thank you, all the organizers, for this opportunity to participate to this very important conference. I hope you can see my presentation that is about constitutional space for cities in Europe from the perspective of the European Union and the Council of Europe. First of all, I would like to highlight the specific condition of cities in the European context and the differences with worldwide trends. Also in Europe, in fact, there is a growing urbanization process, considering that more than 70% of the European population lives in cities, and there is also a transformation of the urban system. There are more than 160,000 of local governments in the Council of Europe, 47 member states, including 90,000 in the European Union, 27 member states. These local governments are mainly a mixture of small, medium-sized, and large cities. Depending on the classifications, there are only few global cities, but no megacities, or at least only few megacities. And also the European context is characterized by a low growth and medium density compared to global standards. So generally, there is a high heterogeneity of European cities in size, types, and autonomy recognized within member states. And despite the ancient and glorious history of European cities, for example, Venice is celebrating this month 1,600 years. Despite this history, there is a strong centralization process that began in the 17th centuries, brought to a strong prevalence of the states and marginalization of cities, whose status is mainly in the hands of the states. So as highlighted by Ran Hischl in his recent book of last year, European cities have less constitutional relevance compared to other parts of the world, especially the global south. So in this context, what is the role of the Council of Europe and the European Union? This is my research question. The Council of Europe has been the first international organization to recognize the relevance of supranational entities by providing, since 1957, a representative assembly, a conference of local authorities of Europe that later became the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities. But most important, the Council of Europe promoted several conventions and soft law instruments aimed at evaluating the role of local authorities, such as the most important is the European Charter of Local Self-Government that was signed in Strasbourg in 1985, and then later ratified by whole Council of Europe member states. So the European Charter is the only international treaty with the aim of promoting and protecting subnational entities. But it's important, is linked with the recognition within member states. So according to some scholars, the Charter has a potential constitutional value and still represents the foundation for a multi-level governance system and guarantees a common standard of protection in Europe. Briefly, the evaluation of the role of cities by Council of Europe is strictly linked or related to the role that local authorities and cities play for democracy. That is one of the pillars of the Council of Europe. Cities are not specifically mentioned in the charter because they are implied within local levels, local authorities, or local self-governments. However, in recent years, they also received attention by several documents and proposals. For example, I can mention the European Urban Charter that was adopted in 1992 and later updated in 2008. But also the Council of Europe Intercultural City Program and the attention to the status of capital cities with 3 recommendations, the last one adopted last year. The promotion of cooperation among municipalities through various initiatives and exchange of practice. In this case, the evaluation of the role of cities is linked also with the role that city can play with the promotion of human rights. Passing to the European Union context, it is well known that there were no mention of local governments in the founding treaties, but also that the European Union's attitude toward this institution has changed during years, passing from a situation of irrelevance of subnational entities toward the introduction of many changes in the European Union treaties and policies. We can mention, for example, the role of subnational entities in the cohesion policy, the principle of subsidiarity, the Committee of Regions, etc. But it's also well known that the European attention has been firstly and mainly focused on the role of regions, while other subnational entities has been considered indistinctively as a general unified category. For example, we can look at the composition of the Committee of Regions, where cities are very small representations. However, as highlighted by De Visser in a recent article, and she presented also yesterday at this conference, there are at least 6 possible ways of interaction between the European Union and cities as implementation agents of European Union rules, values community, frontline decision makers, democracy enhancers, policy developers, and advocates of urban interest in the EU decision making. More recently, the cities have received specific and growing consideration within European Union. And this attention has been mainly passed through intergovernmental processes that have seen the adoption of documents by ministers responsible for urban development. For example, I can mention the urban agenda for the EU, the new Leipzig Charter, the territorial agenda, and many other specific programs, projects, and funds. What is important to notice is that there is a long debate on the role of cities behind these policies. A debate which involves EU institutions, city networks, and member states. For example, there is a European Parliament resolution of 2018 that highlighted the role of cities in the institutional framework of the European Union and the role of cities to enhance European Union citizenship. Here, there are some of the results of the European Urban Agenda, among which I would like to highlight these 2 results. The enhancement of the national regional urban policy making and the better positioning of cities at national and European level. So a brief conclusion. What is the role of the Council of Europe and European Union? In a European context, when the role of cities is determined mainly by states, the role of supranational institutions seems powerless, but could make a difference. In fact, through programs, funds, and other forms of participation, The role of cities what is highlighted is the role of cities for democracy and human rights protection. In different ways, what I think is that the Council of Europe and the European Union carve out space for cities. It is true that the repercussions on their constitutional relevance within member states are still limited, but the situation could change. In fact, it is emerging that the strengthening of the role of cities in a multi-level system could be a counterbalance of dispersion of participation related to globalization and a remedy to respond to recent crises in Europe. In recent time, in fact, we are more aware that every crisis, economic crisis, rule of law crisis, has a urban dimension in both repercussions and remedies. The pandemic, for example, has challenged the role of all institutions from the top to the bottom. And moreover, the need to recovery, to economic recovery, social recovery, etc. in Europe through many programs, for example, the recovery plans, could be a precious opportunity for cities to solve many of the current problems, infrastructural problems, inequalities, innovations that also the other panelists have highlighted, with repercussions on the role of cities, on their relationship with other levels of governments, in a few words, on their constitutional space. Thank you.
Thanks. That was really interesting. Thank you all for having me. I think I'm up next. I really appreciate being invited to this. I'm more U.S. based, so I'll just say a little bit about what we're seeing with cities and institutional design and innovation in the U.S. And hopefully it'll tie into some of the presentations that preceded me about the European setting and especially the Italian setting. I'm going to fight the hypothetical a little bit. This panel is about innovation in cities around the world, and I'm in some ways against innovation, to be a little bit provocative. I've written about city power more than innovation, and the reason I've done that is because I'm concerned that innovation suggests that cities' both economic and political problems can be solved if we just think hard and long enough about how to design the appropriate institutions, again, either political or economic. And I'm a little bit skeptical of that position. I do think there are some institutional design questions that are important in the United States. For example, it's the question of whether cities have home rule and what kind of home rule they have. That is, do they have immunity from centralized directives? Do they have sufficient funds to do the things that they're supposed to do? And state constitutions in the US and the federal constitution do have something to say about that. Unfortunately, the federal constitution in the United States, I think in Rand Herschel's terms, do ignore cities or the constitutional space for cities. I think that's purposeful because state-based federalism or a regional tier of government does get in the way of actual decentralization in the United States. And that may be the case in Europe too. In Italy, it sounds like what they're trying to do is make some space for that, though I'm a little nervous that adding a whole regional tier of government will only weaken cities more, not strengthen them. So I'd be interested in what the panelists have to say about that in terms of institutional design. But in terms of fighting the hypothetical and in terms of innovation and my skepticism of that, there are two forms of power that I'm interested in. One is the actual power of cities to adopt regulations, legislation, policy without being in US terms preempted by states or the national government. And the second is their power to promote their own economies and fiscal health. I think that often when we think about innovation in cities around the world, we're thinking about, well, how can they be innovative in terms of developing policies that are responsive to their constituents and address problems such as global warming, inequality, discrimination, housing. But we also think about whether they can adopt innovative policies to stem economic decline and promote economic well-being while not displacing the poor or causing gentrification or other kinds of processes that result in the inequality and the bifurcation of the rich and the poor. I'm uncertain about this latter program as an innovative possibility for cities. That is, I'm uncertain about whether they can control their economic fates. I don't think we know enough about why cities grow and decline. I don't think we know enough about what they can do to preserve equity in their cities. I don't know if we know enough about the flow of capital outside of cities and into other places, or the flow into cities and other places. And so I want us to be really careful, I think, in talking about innovation, that we don't mistake city decline or city decline economically or fiscally with a failure of imagination. I don't think cities are being governed poorly and therefore they decline economically. I think cities are often governed quite well and they still experience economic decline. So I want us to be careful about innovation, using innovation to suggest that cities are in some kind of competition with other cities. If they would just do a better job at innovating or being clever or being creative in their planning, etc., they would do better economically. I'm not sure that's true. In fact, I'm pretty skeptical of that. Innovation in another setting, however, in the setting of political institutions or design or power, which is really what I'm concerned about, that's possible. I'm not sure it's necessary. Often what's necessary for cities to have is just the basic powers to provide for their citizens with basic municipal goods. And so a lot of what cities are doing in their sort of creative aspect is being forced to do certain kinds of things because they don't have the authority to do other kinds of things. And so often innovation is really a workaround that's a result of a lack of authority or a lack of power. At least that's what I see in the United States. And so I want to emphasize less on the innovation side in terms of what cities are doing and more on their authority and power to do the basic things that cities are supposed to do. Health, safety, welfare, education, all of those things that often cities in the United States aren't able to do. They don't have the capacity to do them, either the fiscal or the regulatory capacity to do them, or they're in serious economic decline, and so they don't have the resources. Those kinds of problems are not a problem of innovation. What we see is cities, struggling cities all over the United States, doing amazing things, working really hard to try to counter those large-scale forces that are leading to their struggles, and with very little help, it turns out, from states and the federal government. And that may be actually different from, say, in the European context, where maybe there's some more help, but we can talk about that too. And so, and more importantly, and I just want to highlight this, is that cities in the United States often face significant barriers to exercising their autonomy. The recent pandemic is just a great example of the conflict between cities who say wanted to adopt mask mandates or business closing laws or other health protections in face of the COVID outbreak, and states in many places, Texas is a good example, Florida is another example, put up barriers to doing so, just refusing to allow local governments to act in the service of health and safety for their citizens. Powers which local governments generally have, but of course, which states can override very readily. That's a significant problem and a very basic one. It doesn't entail innovation. It entails seeking powers that cities don't have right now. Another area we've seen just recently is in the state of Georgia, after the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer, local governments have been considering whether to defund their police, that is, move some money out of policing and public safety into other kinds of programs, social welfare and otherwise, equity-driven kinds of budget design. And we've seen in Georgia the state legislature saying or contemplating a law that would mandate that local governments spend a certain percentage of their budgets on public safety, on policing. So that's a huge invasion of local prerogatives to set budgetary priorities, and one that's just incredibly basic. It's not necessarily innovative to decide how much to spend on the police, but of course, if you're unable to make basic budget decisions, that's pretty restrictive of your authority. So, my interest in comparative innovation in terms of cities is to figure out what kind of workarounds, basically, that they're employing to in many cases, it seems to me, to exercise power when they don't actually have power. I think that's what's happening in many of these instances. I think there's centralization is very powerful impulse. It's a powerful impulse in the United States. I think it's a powerful impulse in Europe. We have centralized social welfare states, which are very powerful and important in huge ways, but they've often treated cities as an afterthought, as many of these panelists have suggested. And so I think there needs to be a fundamental rethinking of the role of cities in the social welfare state. I think we have to think a little harder about how much power we want cities to actually have and what they're capable of doing. And I think two things. One, I think they're capable of social welfare redistribution in bigger ways than we've thought of before, and we can talk a little bit about that. But I think they're less capable of fixing their own economies, because I think we don't know enough about how that works. And so if we start to think about innovation as blaming cities for their decline and celebrating cities for their rise, I think we could get on the wrong track. Thanks so much. I look forward to the conversation.
Hi, everybody. Okay, we have so much to talk about. There are so many fascinating overlaps and questions that I already see brewing on the chat. So I'm just going to dive right in and hope to capture some of the questions that have been raised in the chat. So one tension that was exposed just looking across all of your presentations was the difference between innovative policy that comes from cities themselves, which perhaps, as Rich says, is linked to restrictions in their power, the workarounds, as he puts it, that they're doing, versus innovation in the design of municipal institutions themselves. So the way that constitutions are crafted to carve out space for cities, the innovation that state governments are creating as a result of the way that they've designed these institutions. And so the first question that I have for the panelists is, do you think that constitutional design matters? If you build it, will cities rise to the challenge of their increased constitutional security, or maybe increased constitutional role if they've been given particular powers as part of that institutional design? Or do you think there's more of a bottom-up exercise that needs to happen, that the the institutional design is, may or may not succeed. It doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, it's all about what is needed in that particular place, in that particular region. So I'd love to just throw that out there for the group, kind of picking up almost on the reflections of your colleagues here on the panel, but also this larger question of, if we build it, will they come? So maybe I'll turn first to the start of the panel. The first panelist always, unfortunately, gets a bit lost by the end of it. So maybe I'll start with Erika to see if you have any reflections on that.
Thank you, Alex. Does the constitutional design matter? I would like to offer some thoughts on that, which was actually the question that I was trying to answer at the end of my presentation. So is constitutional entrenchment or constitutional design enough to empower city to strengthen their role? I don't think it is necessarily the case. It could be considered as a first initial step. It might seem like having cities entrenched in the constitution as an important aspect, an important way to empower them. But then, if this constitutional design or constitutional entrenchment is not does not come with other aspects, it's not really serving the purpose of empowering cities. So maybe perhaps in the Italian case, and I don't know if Gabriella or Annika have different thoughts in this regard. It could be seen as, since it's fairly new, it could be seen as a first a step towards a more robust empowering of metropolitan areas. But this is, of course, left to be seen. So we don't know if we will go in that direction. Perhaps some adjustments will be needed in the existing law that, as I said, was meant to be only transitory in nature. Perhaps new adjustments also at the constitutional level will be required. But I would like to see, I like to imagine that constitutional design, or in the Italian case, that constitutional entrenchment matters, but it's not enough in and of itself. So
thank you. Thank you. Annika, what do you think? You seem to be leaning more towards the bottom-up needs versus the constitutional design part.
Not necessarily. I would agree with Erika in that it very much depends. And I think the constitutional entrenchment of municipal autonomy is certainly very important. But for example, in the Italian case, I would also say that the actual implementation of constitutional provisions is also necessary. So you, as Erika has mentioned, you have fiscal autonomy mentioned in the Italian constitution also for metropolitan cities, but so far it requires an enactment decree by the national legislature, and that hasn't passed yet, although we're 20 years, it's 20 years later. And so if you give powers to cities, also constitutionally, you need to follow up on those powers and need to enable cities through, for example, fiscal provisions to be able to implement them. And in a different paper that I co-wrote with my colleague Carl Kosler, that we presented in a very nice workshop in Melbourne 2 years ago, we look at the European Charter, and maybe Gabriella can also speak to that, the European Charter on Local Self-Government, and so the different aspects that they outline for local self-government. And I think those are very interesting steps that can be taken to see how cities can better govern themselves. And in that sense, I think constitutional entrenchment does not necessarily impede cities from being innovative. I would say the opposite, but cities then need to have the potential to, well, maybe on the one hand, grow beyond. So they need to still have the power to act on their own. It can't be too restrictive, but if there are provisions, they need to be followed up by, for example, fiscal resources so that cities can act on their powers.
Excellent. Gabriella, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I follow my previous colleagues, Erika and Annika, on their reflections. Also, I think as they highlighted that constitutional entrenchment is necessary, is a first step, especially for constitutional protection. So they offer constitutional protection when others there are others political initiatives to centralize. So it could be a way, no, it could be, it's a necessary step to protect their autonomy together with the other international instrument as the Charter of Local Self-Governments. But it's a first and necessary step. But it's also very important, the political implementation of the constitutional provision, because if we look at the Italian constitution, I think we have all that what we need in the constitution for the regions, for the cities, and for all local governments. But the reality is far from the charter. So the reality, the effective implementation is very far away from what is written in the constitution, from the region and the cities and metropolitan areas. So what I would like only to add that what is necessary is to try to change step by step the institutional culture. So because I think that we have a constitutional institutional culture that is against the cities. So one of the most interesting part of the book of Ran Hirschl is that he pointed out that there is a culture against the city, a special status against the cities. And in Italy, we experience this every time, in every crisis, there is this centralization process, and we try to touch the subnational governments and the regions. And lastly, it's also important, the bottom-up perspective, so the perception of the role that city can play. And in this case, because I mean, in Italy and in Europe, there are so many small cities, it's important the action of the networks of cities, such as EuroCities or others networks of cities. So together they can do more and more. They can obtain visibility, policies. This is what they do in the European Union. And they are more effective than the institutions that represent their interest. I mean, in the Council of Europe or in the European Union, they are more effective than the Committee of Regions, for example.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Rich, but I'm going to add a little wrinkle stemming from the questions that are coming up in the chat, Rich. So much of the, just building on this question, so much of the intervention, it seems like in the US, is about states interfering with city power. So in thinking about constitutional protection, do you think home rule is needed in order to safeguard basically cities from states stepping in and, you know, and impeding their power?
Yes. I'm an advocate for a more robust home rule provisions in state constitutions. I've authored a model, helped author a model statute with the National League of Cities. I don't think it's sufficient. I think it's a step in the way the other panelists are talking about sort of institutional design. I think there is a parallel in the progressive era move towards home rule in the beginning of the 20th, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century in the United States, which was a reaction to state legislative overreach and basically takeovers of cities and governance of cities directly by the legislature. We've got a weak form of home rule, and home rule hasn't worked that well, in part because I think there are two things. One, it doesn't give cities a great deal of immunity, constitutional immunity from overrides. And two, home rule can be used as a way of allowing states or the feds, but mostly states, engage in what I call selective localism, which is they can intervene when they want to, and then pull back and say, well, that's not our responsibility, right? So Detroit is failing. That's their problem. They're corrupt. They mismanage their resources. They've done lots of terrible things. We're not responsible for those people in that city, even though there are many hundreds of thousands of them. But we will stop you from engaging in adopting a minimum wage or plastic bag bans or anti-discrimination law. So I think some of the questions in the chat are about that relationship, and I think that is a relationship we have to look at quite closely. It's not just a red state. It's often thought of as a red state or Republican blue city kind of divide. It's not that solely, although it's exacerbated by the rural-urban divide that we see in the United States. In New York and California, we also have significant conflicts, even if the city is governed by a member of the same party as the state. New York and New York City is a good example of that. The other thing is states do provide support to cities, but they also impose unfunded mandates and other kinds of impositions. And there has to be a dynamic in which higher levels of government who have more capacity, more fiscal capacity, do share that fiscal capacity with cities and with local governments more generally. There are ways to do that while protecting some amount of local autonomy at the same time. That's certainly a tricky line, because folks that are funding want to have a say in how those funds are spent, et cetera. But it turns out metropolitan areas are generating the bulk of economic development in the United States and all over the world. And so right now, money is flowing out of them, not into them, in lots of ways.
Okay, let's turn to that question of money. So it relates to subsidiarity as well. Which level is the right level to be handling what issue? Which is always a tinkering that, if you were Richard Albert, you would say you need to have good, robust mechanisms for change within your constitution to account for it. Or other scholars have talked about intergovernmental agreements as being a better place for sorting out those questions because they change. But clearly, and many of you brought it up in the context of your presentations, if not directly, subsidiarity, then indirectly as it relates to funding. So how do we balance the fact that cities have innovative ideas, they know the people who live within them, and they're maybe better positioned to introduce novel policy, but they don't necessarily have the funding to execute the decisions that they make. So what do you each think about that? Maybe I'll start in the opposite direction with Rich on this one.
So I think that there are a couple of things. One at the outset is, at least in the United States, there's lots of limits on the ability for local governments to raise funds, even if they seek to do so. So tax and expenditure limitations, debt limitations, various other things, some of which were a response to the fear that local governments would engage in too much borrowing or too much spending. And that just shows a certain kind of distrust for the locals, and sometimes that does occur, and there can be some abuses. That's one issue, which is just that there are restrictions on the ways locals are allowed to raise revenue. I think they're significant. There's another issue, which is, what does a declining or spiraling city do? That is, when the tax base is fleeing, when industrial employment or post-industrial employment has fled. And what we ask cities to do is create innovation districts, or try to attract tech hubs, or create universities and hospitals, right? In which maybe they have, maybe they don't. To have more quality housing that is attractive to millennials or something like that, or Gen X's. These are all just strike me as crazy things to do in response to large-scale structural economic dislocation, which is what a lot of these cities have been experiencing. The Rust in the U.S., the Rust Belt cities and other cities have been experiencing for a long time now. And at least in the United States, we tend to just abandon those places, which is quite unfortunate. And so in those instances, you have to fund that. They can't fund it themselves. You just have to fund that. And I think there's not really any way around that. If you want a healthy network of cities that can recover in various ways. Again, all of this is premised on the idea that that the cities get the revenue that they raise in their territorial jurisdiction, but those territorial jurisdictional lines are arbitrary, as we know. And who gets the money and who doesn't get the money and whose money it is, who owns that money, is contestable.
Maybe I'll circle back to Italy for a minute. So I think, if I'm not missing what you said, that in the constitutional entrenchment of regions, funding was one of those things that was unfinished. It's been left out of a solution, or as being part of the solution. So do you think that there is room for positive change when it comes to these larger metropolitan areas being able to keep revenue and therefore innovate in their policies? Or is the combination right now with boundaries being struck and institutions being created, but the funding element existing outside of the region? So maybe I'll start with Erika and then move to Annika.
So I guess when it comes to financing and money, it's always a problem everywhere. So from my understanding, yes, so the Constitution recognizes the financial and fiscal autonomy of metropolitan cities, also of regions, of provinces, of municipalities. But then again, the reality is quite different. Regions are, of all local governments, are perhaps the richer entities, but even regions are always fighting with the central government to the extent, to what extent they can keep for themselves the revenues that they raise. But certainly they have some room for action there. But in terms of municipalities and metropolitan cities, the revenue raising capacity is much more limited, and particularly for metropolitan cities, because nothing has really been done. I don't think there is much autonomy when it comes to that. Also, the expectation from the law, the national law that regulates the cities, and also from what is mentioned in some of the metropolitan statutes or charters, there is an expectation that metropolitan cities attract or contribute to attract fundings from particularly the European Union. So they are expected to promote activities to promote innovation, to go back to the point, but and particularly collaborate with other European cities and attract investments, attract fundings. But of course, it's not easy. It's easier said than done. So I think at the moment, when it comes to the fiscal aspect or the financial capabilities of metropolitan cities, we are touching a very sensitive aspect in Italy, and it's certainly something that needs to be clarified.
Annika, what do you think? Do you think the money aspect of the conversation is one of the major challenges in Italy? I mean, you note the overlap, the mismatch and overlap of boundaries as being a key issue. What about the funding side, the ability of these governments to actually make good policy decisions like redistribution of wealth and smart cities and many other things that have been touched on in the panel so far?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with Erika. And I think, well, if you look at it from metropolitan cities as hubs for innovation, and the argument that Rich also mentioned in terms of competitive cities, then EU funding it would play along well with that narrative, in the sense that you have the structural financing, which is actually probably not enough, of the provinces, of the old provinces that the metropolitan cities incur for those old provincial competences in a way, and then the new metropolitan competences could be funded through EU funds. I mean, that could be a line of argumentation maybe that could be followed, but I think at the same time, and you see that also in the metropolitan strategic plans, that a lot of the activities are funded through European programs, for example, the Next Generation EU, so the recovery instrument now with COVID-19. But at the same time, you also you maybe need more of a structural funding basis, not necessarily one that are ad hoc funding schemes that give you money for certain projects for a certain amount of years, but then they run out and you're not sure that there will be follow-up funds that can continue and assure the sustainability of these programs.
Thank you. Gabriella, I'm going to turn to you, but I'm going to add a little bit of a twist to the question, given the context within which you're coming. So Rand Herschel, whose work has come up a lot amongst this panel, weighed into the conversation, and it was on the question of constitutional entrenchment. And so he suggested that, you know, perhaps the question of constitutional entrenchment is similar to any other core value like equality or freedom of expression or religion. And so it's not sufficient in and of itself, but it depends on other factors. And at the same time, we would never say that we don't need to have these entrenchments, and we would just leave it all to innovation. And so my question for Gabriella, and if you want to tie into the money side, that would be great too, but don't feel you have to, is do you think that the way in which the EU has recognized cities in I would say maybe a soft way, like soft powers, rather than entrenchment in perhaps the way that I think about it, and I'm going to suggest that maybe Rich thinks about it. Do you think that it accounts for this core value? Is there a core value of the need for robust local governments?
Well, yes, I think it's also related to funds. The two reflections are connected because yes, it's true that the European unions try to evaluate subnational governments for the European objectives, like to obtain to reinforce the European Union aim and objective. So the purpose is to reinforce the European Union. And to this objective, the European Union is giving attention also to the local and regional authorities because it thinks that the two objectives are related. And the only way in which the European Union can obtain this result is through funds, money, participation, some forms of involvement, because there is this provision in the Treaty of European Union that is one of the fundamental provisions, that is the respect of constitutional identity. So the European Union cannot force anything within member states, does not have any power to the constitutional matters or to interfere with constitutional identity of member states, including the local governments. But the only way to involve the local governments and the cities is through funds. So Annika mentioned the cohesion policy, and that is a very huge, it's one of the main part of the European Union budget. And recently also the recovery funds and all these projects that are being presented through these new programs could be a very big opportunity also to introduce many innovating policies, because these funds go together with programs, concrete projects that should be innovative projects. So, well, I don't know if I answered your questions. Yes, I think it's a complicated moment, but yes, I think the European Union is trying to highlight the role that cities can play, and so to prepare some space of debate and some role, some funds, all the conditions that can empower cities in a public debate, also within member states.
Alex, can I just jump in on the Rand's kind of question, which is, I think constitutional entrenchment, a lot of it depends on how much you trust, say, courts to enforce those provisions and in what direction. It may have expressive power to entrench certain kinds of forms of local autonomy, but it also may just serve as a shifting of power to say the judiciary in the United States. That's what it does. It just shifts the authority to decide who decides to the Supreme Court of the United States in federalism questions and state courts in home rule questions. That may be something you want to do, but there are some drawbacks to doing that. And so then the question is, how do you, are there other ways to institutionalize city power that don't necessarily involve judicial, such a significant judicial role? I don't know the answer to that, actually.
What about actually, I was going to jump in with another question, but it's an interesting, it's an important comment that was made about the judicial role. Within Italy, for example, have the courts weighed in on this question of, the new municipal structure, or is it still playing out, in terms of institutional play, like in institutional design? You can tell it's early in BC because I can't quite get the words out, but yeah, have the courts been involved at this point in figuring out where the power lies in Italy? Maybe Erika, I'll jump over to you.
The court, particularly in the aftermath of the 2001 constitutional amendment, the court really played a very important role for 2 or 3 years or even more. All the Constitutional Court was doing was trying to decide cases on division of powers between the national government and regions at the time, because those were the main legislative powers and centers, because then municipalities and provinces and metropolitan cities do not have constitutionally recognized legislative powers. So there was a lot of litigation at the time, and the court also contributed to redefining a little bit the division of legislative powers. So the court plays, and to a certain extent still play some role when it comes to regions and the central government as the main legislative powers. So when it comes to municipalities or metropolitan cities, the role of the court is much less influential. There was an important decision of the court in the aftermath of the Del Rio law, but it was more on the constitutionality of the law in and of itself, whether the law would actually fit into the constitutional scheme that was in place. And the court concluded that yes, metropolitan cities, as they were design in the law basically fit into the constitutional framework. I mean, I don't know, Annika or Gabriella, if you have other views, but this is my understanding of the role of court of the role of constitutional court in this regard.
I mean, it's important to think about the courts, obviously, but we don't want to lose sight about the fact that constitutions and municipal power are designed ultimately, I think, for people on the ground who are dependent on the services that exist. Some of the chats have mentioned accountability, values like accountability. Rand mentioned values like equality. I mean, I think, many of us would argue that municipal autonomy is linked to those values. That's why we care about it, because we care about cities being able to make these decisions for people who are affected by them. One thing that also came up in your talks was around too much government. Like, are there too many layers of power that exist? And Professor Zach Taylor mentioned it in the chat as well, that really we want to urge so-called higher levels of government to step in when needed, if it's around funding or other things, because ultimately these people who are dependent on services and programs are losing out. And we certainly see that in the Canadian context around things like housing and tent encampments, where a lot of governments, local and otherwise, are kind of putting their hands up and punting the ball to another level of government. So maybe I'll punt this ball back to you of, is there too much government? I mean, and really thinking about it from your, not too much government in the political sense, but are there too many layers of government involvement in a way that actually obscures who has responsibility to act for the public good or for public programming? So let's start with, maybe I'll start with Gabriella, and then circle around, at least on my screen, around the group.
Well, if there are too many governments, too many layers, is that the concern? Well, I'm actually a fan of the multi-level governance system. I think that they need to collaborate more. So we don't need to reduce the layers of governments, but they need to figure out how they can collaborate together. So to try to think of form of collaborations and decision making that can work better. And especially with the pandemic, we understood better that we need every level of governments to do their job, like the international institutions, the supranational institutions, the national, the regional, and the local governments. But in a harmonized in the cooperative models, because what we are experiencing now, it's contracts and conflicts more than cooperations and other form of collaboration. We have the same policies that come from the European Union. I mean, for the environment, for example, we have one policy, the protection of the environment, that has to be implemented by the European Union, the member states, the regions, and the cities. We cannot cut one of these levels. We need every level to do a small part of the bigger job.
Thank you. Rich, over to you. What do you think? Too much? Too little?
Yes, too much. Well, not enough government in some places, too much in other places. I'm on record as criticizing more recently, but going back also as criticizing states in the United States as often problematic in various ways. And so state-based federalism in the United States is, and this goes to the constitutional point in part, is a kind of entrenched, is not just kind of entrenched feature of our constitutional scheme. And what it does do is, and Jonathan Rodden has written a book recently on this, it combined with other features of our electoral system like gerrymandering and so forth, does contribute to the weakness of urban political coalitions and the weakness of cities in particular. And so, and contributes, I think, to the rural-urban split that we see quite dramatically in the United States, maybe less dramatically in other places, in part because of institutional, certain forms of institutional entrenchment here, which are problematic. For example, our Senate has equal representation for the least populated states and the most populous states. The most rural states have the same representation as the most urban states. So that's a problem. And so that is a form of entrenchment that is troubling. I don't think we're going to see a change in that. So that results in, then you have to have workarounds of various kinds to deal with those kinds of institutional barriers. So I think states have been quite aggressive, again, in overriding local authority in the United States. It's a regional tier of government between the local and the national. There's also often pushes for regional governments, often for good reasons, to internalize externalities, spillover effects, share revenue, those kinds of things. But it turns out a lot of those layers either diffuse authority in the way you're talking about, or they override local authority that could be granted there.
So Annika and Erika, I'm going to leave you the option, a choose your own adventure. You can answer that question, or you can answer this question, which is are things ultimately place-based? You know, the lessons from Italy, is there any way to transfer those lessons to the North American context, or is it so specific to the context within which it emerges? So your pick of either one, too many institutions or the place-based question. Maybe we'll start with Annika.
Now I had more time to think about the first question. So I think I will go with that. And I think an interesting contrast here is, if you look at Austria and Germany, the second-tier local governments are actually designed for more rural contexts. So where you have cities, the second-tier local governments, the city takes on both the municipal responsibilities and the second-tier responsibilities. Now with the metropolitan cities in Italy, it's kind of the opposite approach. You still have second-tier local governments that deal with the different municipalities, but I guess in a way they try to balance that with the metropolitan mayor. So you have the mayor of the core city that also has who also has the leading role then of the metropolitan city. But maybe it is the case that here it would make more sense to have more of less of a top-down approach to these cities and give more powers to the actual metropolitan areas and the functional urban areas, and to deal with it this way. Otherwise, I'm more with Gabriella that I think multi-level governance is a good thing and should be strengthened. It shouldn't, but of course, as always, it's institutional design should be good. I mean, also for citizens, it's breaking it down into that is it should be a work in progress and should be adapted where it fails to serve citizens, and it should be enhanced where you see that things are working well. So I think saying there's too much or too little government really depends.
Erika, last word.
Yeah, I'll just put forward some random thoughts. I should also share Gabriella and Annika thoughts about, I am in favor of multi-level governance. I think it's good as long as there is coordination and it's done in an harmonious way. What we have in Italy is a little bit of a contradictory reality, because there are pockets or areas in Italy that are very much in favor of multi-level governance, and they embrace this distribution of powers, and then we have other areas which are more centralist or centralistic in their approach, and so there's always this tension. Is it too much or is it too little? So it's complicated. I think that also the multi-level system that we have in Italy, which also is in similar ways occurs in Spain or other like Germany or Austria, also reflects the specific fabric or texture of the European context, which is like really rich in small, medium, big cities, all connected, all close by. There is a long history of city independence in Europe. So I think it reflects a little bit the European context, and I don't know how transferable it is maybe to North America or to other realities which have a different history, different geography. But certainly I think that when it comes to the constitutional entrenchment, if there is an agreement that this is a good thing, then maybe yes, something can be learned from the European experience.
Thank you so much to this wonderful panel. I have like 1,000 more questions on my list that I won't get to until we meet again. But Erika, you can now go to bed, and to everybody else, enjoy the rest of your day. And many thanks to those of you who are chiming in the Zoom room. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks
Take care.
all. Thank you, Alex.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.